You're listening to A Day Podcast. Podcast for all things creative. โรงเรียนนานาชาติ International School Podcast. Learning from the expats.
สวัสดีครับและขอต้อนรับทุกท่านครับเข้าสู่รายการโรงเรียนนานาชาติโดย A Day Podcast ครับผมเต้สุบจนกลิ่นสุวรรณนะฮะรับหน้าที่เป็นผู้ดำเนินรายการนะครับซึ่งรายการนี้นะครับจะเป็นการนำเสนอชีวิตเรื่องราวมุมมองที่น่าสนใจของชาวต่างชาตินะฮะที่อาศัยอยู่ในประเทศไทยโดยนอกจากองค์ความรู้และแรงบันดาลใจในแง่มุมต่างๆแล้วนะฮะเราก็หวังว่าการสัมภาษณ์เป็นภาษาอังกฤษทั้งหมดเนี่ยนะฮะจะช่วยทำให้คุณผู้ฟังเนี่ยที่กำลังฝึกภาษาอังกฤษกันอยู่เนี่ยได้ทบทวนแล้วก็พัฒนาภาษาอังกฤษไปในตัวนะครับแขกรับเชิญของเราใน EP นี้นะครับเป็นชายชาวเบลเยียมครับที่หลงไหลการ์ตูนมาตั้งแต่วัยเด็กฮะและเมื่อปี 2014 ครับเขามีโอกาสได้เดินทางมาประเทศไทยครับเพื่อเรียนที่จะเป็นครูสอนดำน้ำนะฮะแล้วก็จริงๆเขาค้นพบตัวเองทีหลังว่าเขาหลงรักประเทศไทยและหลงรักหนังสือการ์ตูนไทยเป็นอย่างยิ่งทำให้เขาเริ่มสะสมมาตั้งแต่วันนั้นจนถึงบัดนี้เลยนะฮะแล้วก็เขาก็ทำการวิจัยหนังสือการ์ตูนไทยอย่างจริงจังในฐานะอาจารย์คณะนิเทศศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยนะครับถือโอกาสนี้ขอต้อนรับอาจารย์นิโคลัสวาสเตเปนครับสวัสดีครับอาจารย์ครับ
Sawadika.
Did I pronounce your name correctly อาจารย์
Yes, perfect.
All right Nicholas Verstappen นะ
Yes.
Can I call you อาจารย์นิก
Yeah, Ajahn is perfect.
Is that how your Thai students would refer to you?
No, Ajahn Nicholas they would say.
Ajahn Nicholas. Okay.
You can say Ajahn Nicholas.
โอเคได้อาจารย์นิโคลัสก็ได้นะครับ Well, thank you so much for joining our program today นะครับ I've already told the Thai audience that you fell in love and have been collecting and studying Thai comics since 2014. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
All right, cool. Now, the words studying and comics shouldn't really be put in the same sentence.
Yeah, and I would say first that thank you for having me in your podcast. I really appreciate. And but first, I would say I disagree. I think comics should be studied like any form of art. We can study paintings, we can study films, we can study photographs. Why shouldn't we be studying comics? It's an art form, and I think it's a really sophisticated art form, really complex. In many ways, and we see it as probably easy, and usually it's disregarded and seen as something for children. But it's not accurate. Comics, for most of its history, has been aimed for an adult audience. Since it was created in 1830 in Switzerland, for more than a century, comics were made by adults for adults, and only later in the 20th century it became more associated with children. But it's and now we are again getting back more and more to discovering how graphic novels or really challenging stories like we were mentioning earlier, V for Vendetta, for instance, are really serious books about social issues, and actually comics can talk about any subject. They can deal with any topic, political, intimate. They can talk about trauma, sexual abuse, whatever you want to say, and with really something that is specific to it, because you can do things with comics that you cannot do with other media, for instance.
So comics don't really make you laugh all the time.
Oh, no, I laugh a lot when I'm reading some comics. I like Dr. Slump or Calvin and Hobbes. I'm laughing a lot. But then I'm mostly reading serious comics, which is what I'm actually studying about. Yes.
Then again, the words serious and comics, I never thought they would, fit into one sentence.
Yes, indeed. It's sometimes a shame that it's called comics because it's associated with humor and we always think that there is the humor in it because of the word comics. But there is much more to it than just fun. And I think Art Spiegelman, who is a major writer who wrote the graphic novel Mouse, he's writing it COMIX. Comics, because he thinks it's and mixing together. It's not for him about humor, it's about mixing text and pictures together. So he's thinking comics in terms of co-mixing, blending things together.
But at the end of the day, without any audio, without any movement, a lot of interpretation has to be done by the reader. him or herself.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I think it's something, there is a misconception for many decades. Teachers were considering that comics would make you lazy because that you would actually have all the pictures and all the text, and you would have no appeal for imagination because in novels, there is only the text, and you need to figure out and think about the images in your mind. But comics would make you lazy because there are both the text and the images, and there would be no creativity for the reader. But it's actually the opposite. And more academic studies are showing that we are working much more when we read comics, because we have to use two modes. One is the written part, the other is the art and the drawings. And we have to make links and connect text and pictures together all the time, then all the pictures together. And in the comics, we don't see much. What actually we see less than there is. We only see, for instance, two panels, but there is a gap in between, and between every single panel we have to figure out what is happening, so we are invited to fill that blank between every single panel. In a movie, it's a flow, and you just follow the film, you just watch images after images, but you are not asked to participate as much. And I think comics is really asking us to participate a lot, and that in academic studies is shown by the way that we remember more things when we learn them from comics, because we are using a different part of our brains. We are using it for the written part, and we are using it to actually understand the pictures and the link between them. And it means that all the information that we actually gather while reading comics are staying much more deeper in our mind and our brain. So actually teaching and learning with comics is highly beneficial for students, because we remember more with comics than just reading a plain text.
I see. So a comic reader must literally read and interpret between the lines.
Yes.
Or in this case, between the boxes.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
All right. We were talking before we entered the studio that when you arrived in Thailand, it was a few days before the 2014 coup.
Yes,
by
indeed.
our current prime minister.
Yes,
Okay.
indeed.
So that was a pretty good impression.
Yeah, I mean,
arrival.
it was mostly for us. We were quite in despair because we had sold everything in Belgium, and we had moved here with just enough money to stay 1 year. And within 1 year, we had to be diving instructor, find a job, and so on. We thought that we would never get a job, and so we stayed there during 1 year, learning how to read Thai, and then at some point, I thought, well, one of my dream is to be teaching. I really wanted to be a teacher at that point, and then
Any particular subject that you would like to teach?
Yeah, it was comics, of
Duh.
course. Yeah, and then I decided, okay, I have nothing to lose. I will just send my resume to Thai universities, and then I just got so lucky. I sent it to many faculties, but then just 1 week after I sent, I got a reply from the Faculty of Communication Arts, and
In Chula.
in Chulalongkorn University, and the manager of the program, Ajahn Jirayud. Ajahn Jirayud is actually really interested in comics too, and in all Vertigo, British comics, and all comics that are used about social issues and so on. And so, yeah, I just felt so lucky that someone would share the same interest with me and see the value of actually teaching about comics art in a university level. Yeah.
Right. Now, talking about Thai comics, what is so fascinating about Thai comics and what makes it unique?
Well, that's a really long. I mean, I could give a really long answer to that because it's been 5 years that I've been studying Thai comics. I'm just finished writing a book about the history of Thai comics that will be published by the end of the year. For me, first, when I started doing research, I thought there was not much because nobody's really talking about Thai comics and about old Thai comics. I was really interested by the new generation, all the artists like Tunadun, Argino, Puck, Saart, Fan, Ear, and all these artists because they were Wisut Panimit and Sutishat Sarapaingwanit and so on. And I was really interested by this new generation, and I started interviewing them, making my research about alternative and indie comics in Thailand. But I discovered they didn't know anything about old Thai comics, everything before 2000 or before 1990.
Right.
And then I started to research about that and discover that it's lost. I mean, it's really hard to find information, and that's what took me so long. It's just 4 years trying to gather information about the comics that started in Thailand in 1907 and really start to explode in 1932 with the Siamese Revolution. And then there were amazing and stunning Thai artists. I mean, people like Sawat Chutarap, and now we've discovered Jamnong Rodari, which is a Thai cartoonist from 1932, and all his work was lost.
Right.
But then 3 months ago, someone discovered boxes in an attic. And actually, in that box, there were all his comics from 1932 and 1933. Original
Wow.
cut in the newspapers and stocked there. And they've been there for decades. And suddenly, it was discovered, and I could acquire them for my research, and he is such an amazing and talented artist. His work is astounding. And then we have others. Then goes Prayun Chanyawong and the cartoon Like, which is amazing. It starts in 1938, 1939. Cartoon Like, yes, and it's amazing because it's one of the most innovative comics form in the whole world at the time. His way of mixing theater and comics all together, the fact that it's actually a metafictional, so you actually see a Like play, and then it blurs and you really enter in a Chak Chak Wong Wong folk tale.
I like that word, Chak Chak Wong Wong.
Yeah,
what's Chak Chak Wong in English?
Oh, I mean, it's a princely folk tale. I mean,
Okay.
there is no equivalent.
I
It's
don't
really
know what
it's really a
right.
form of Thai folk tale where you follow a prince with many princess and wife on the way.
All right.
Usually, is formed by an hermit, the Rusi, the hermit.
Lucy. Okay, hermits,
Rusi.
yeah.
And then he gets some magical powers like turning tamarind leaves into an army of soldiers and so on.
Okay.
I mean, it's really
classic.
Yeah, classic.
All right.
But then you go there, and then suddenly you go back into the Like play because it's interrupted, and Like is interrupted all the time. And it's fascinating because you are always going back and forth between presentation, representation, and so on.
Right.
And that is something that is completely unique, I think, in the 1930s worldwide. Nobody was doing that in the United States, in Europe, or in Japan. It's really a stunning narrative trick that he's doing, and he's doing it to talk about politics, which is really interesting because in Like you can make political comments. It was the only art form where you can actually criticize the government in a way that is somehow accepted because there are play on words and so on. And he was using cartoon Liké to make political comments about the dictatorship and so on.
Right.
And it's really interesting. And then after that, you have all the Raj Le Swang, all the Niai Pap, Jukbien Sakun, who will form the Isan, the artist from the Isan, like Triam Chapchuporn, who is I think my favorite in terms of art. I think he was the Thailand's finest artist in the 1970s, early 1980s.
Right.
And he passed away tragically way too young when he was 39. But he was a real genius in visual art, and I really hope we can reprint his stories and make new versions and also English versions. There is Tawi with Sanokorn, all the cartoon Lemlabat, which is also a fascinating production.
Right. At the moment, how many cartoon books or items, just Thai, do you have in your collection?
I think so. It was really difficult to get them because of the monsoon, the floods, humidity, bookworms. Most of the Thai comics just disappeared because of the weather, and it's a shame that there is no archives, no museum trying to save all these books.
Right.
So I think I've for the main books something like 300 old. So like Niai Pap comics, so the all before 1990, something like 300. But then I have I think 200 old cartoon Lemlabat.
Cartoon Lemlabat, okay.
Too, because I think it's a really interesting production to talk about the trauma of the period. I think cartoon Lemlabat are really about. They are developing in the mid 1970s, so it's during there is the Thammasat massacre, there is all there is the dictatorship, the fight with the communist party in the jungle. There is all the migrant workers who are suffering in Bangkok because of the conditions of work is really tough, and I think the cartoon Lemlabat is exploding in the mid 1970s because it's conveying all the horror of the time. And I think the ghost stories and the peace stories are actually a way to express all the violence and all the anger of that time. I think it's not just stupid stories. Far from that. I think these stories are really relevant in a way to understand what people were experimenting. It was a taboo. You were not able to talk about what you wanted directly, and so all the fear, all the horror, all the frustration, the broken dreams, everything was conveyed in these books.
Right.
Yes.
So encrypted messages about everything in society were written in comics.
I think it's an interesting art form because comics it's more in the margin than we think. It's actually a way that you just need a pen and a paper, and you can make your comments in a cryptic way. You can talk about politics in a diverted way. I think, and on something that is on a daily basis, something that is interesting about comics in worldwide, it's deeply countercultural. It's that comics are usually published like on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, and it means that you are really in touch with what is happening. Something is happening, you can just draw about it, publish it. But if you want to make a novel about it or a movie about it, the novel it's going to take you 6 months, 1 year. A movie it's going to take you 2 years to do.
Plus censorship.
But in the comics you can just print them at a Xerox or photocopy, and you can start spreading them around. And we can see how in the 1970s in the United States and in Japan, alternative comics and indie comics really had an impact on society in spreading new ways of challenging the status quo.
I see. Now, in this day and age, the younger generation go online for entertainment or even for knowledge. So, how do you think comic books can prevail?
I think at first it's developing online. I mean, when we see the Korean webtoons, I mean, they do comics online, and it's a thriving business model. I mean, they are able to produce all these webtoons. But on the other hand, I think, for instance, there is the fanzine culture is coming back. So there are more and more fanzines that are actually published around the world because there is the relation to privacy. We know that when we are online, what we say is scrutinized, and people are sharing it, and it or can access it, or the government can actually access it, or big companies, and more there is a generation that feels like going back to print, because you just print it and then you do 100 copies of your zine and you sell it to a small group, but it remains something that is not lost on the web or
Solid, is that the word?
Yeah, it's solid, and it's something intimate. So we rediscover the intimacy of the books and of the zines and of those kind of production more and more, because I think it's like vinyls. I mean, we thought that they would be dead, but no, they come back and they are selling more and more. We go back to some physical forms because we feel at some point that working and without physicality as its limits too.
Right.
So we need to go back to something physical, and I think we go back to books. And it's something I tell my students, you can study my syllabus online, but you will not remember it as well as if you print it out. Because when we learn on paper, we actually remember things in space. We know that when we try to remember something, it was, I think, on page 3 at the top, there was that paragraph. But it's not happening when you are learning through scrolling, because when you scroll, you never remember in space.
True.
Because it's a long scroll.
Yeah.
So we actually tend to remember things better when they are printed on a page, because we remember things in space.
Right.
So I think we rediscover all that is beneficial in the printed form.
Right. So you're saying that even though the digital era has arrived, and it will stay for maybe forever from now on, you're saying that this form of art, a part of it will be converted into an online platform, but the original tangible copies will still exist.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not desperate about that. I feel we will have to find a balance, and I think there are things we can discover and develop. I love webcomics that are really using the tools of internet. Like we can have those infinite scrolls. So there are comics pages that are huge, and you can actually scroll them for hours.
Right.
Or using infinite stories. I mean, we can do amazing things with comics online. But I think we still have so many things to do on paper.
Right. Ajahn, you're married.
Yes,
You
indeed.
have children? No. What are you going to do with all these valuable assets that you have, these valuable comics that you have in your possession after you're gone?
Oh, I think some of them. So when I left Belgium, I had already to get separate of most of my collection. I had rooms filled of comics.
I can
couldn't take
I can
with
almost
them.
see tears in your
Yeah,
eyes thinking
I know,
of what
but
happened
it
with
was-
those boxes.
Yeah, it
Literally.
was. Yeah, it was. So I just sold some of them, and then some of my favorite, I gave them to my friends or to my nephew, niece, godsons, goddaughters. But I think. In the end, my books, now my collection is in my office at the faculty, and my students are free to borrow them anytime. So it's like some sort of a mini comics library there.
Like a reference section for
Yes,
comics. Yeah,
and I think that's for me. It has. I think 10 years ago I wouldn't lend my comics much because I was a bit obsessed. But then moving here, making the sacrifice of getting most of my books away, and then being with the students, feeling that was important to share, I started to lend them. Some were lost, sadly, but that's how it is. But then I think it's all about sharing, and so at some point, I don't know what I will do with them. At some point, I will give them or make a real comics library.
Right.
That would be great.
I see. What would you name this comic library of yours?
I have no idea yet.
No,
I
yeah.
never thought about it. No, not about a name.
Right, but I'm sure that it's going to be something very valuable and something for people to pick up and research on after.
Yeah, I hope. I mean, we are missing this so much. I think in Thailand, in many countries, but in Thailand too, this idea that there is no archives, no museum, and that's really a shame because so much is lost. And
Right.
getting lost. I mean,
Getting lost.
I've seen a huge collection of Thai comics, one of the biggest I've ever seen, and it's in a garden shed in the back of a garden because it's a collector. He has that collection, and it just stays there because there is nowhere to actually give or put all these books in a real institution.
I see. You've been in Thailand for like 6 years now.
Yes.
Yeah, and you continue to stay here.
Yes, hopefully, yeah.
What is
I
it? What's the beauty of Thailand? I mean, what do you like about living here? What do you like about Jula, about your students?
Oh, it's so the first to be honest, the first years teaching were really tough. At some point, I thought I would quit during the second year. Because the cultural shock was huge between the difference between Belgium way of working and Thai way of working is really different.
So it's not the weather, it's not the pollution, it's not the mosquitoes, but the people.
No, it's not. No, it's not the people. I mean, I love the people. It's really the way of working.
Okay.
I mean, it's how things are planned, prepared, and how in Belgium you always do things 3 months before, but in Thailand it tends to be like done the day before, which just freaks me out because I'm not a control freak, but Europeans are more about controlling things, and here it's more sabai. And so for me it was really challenging to deal with that, because I love square things, things to be square. And but then I had one class of students, they will recognize themselves. It was the performing arts students, and an evening class, only 10 students. And that was just like the best experience. What we were sharing, discussing, it was something really special happening. And for me, it just, I thought this is the job I want to do. And I want to do it with these kids because I think they are so interesting. There are so many things that are interesting about Thailand and Thai culture that I love studying. And yeah, for me, it was, I love teaching at ComArts and also at ComD, the communication design department, because I think these students are so interesting, and there is something that saddens me usually. It's the repressed creativity in Thailand. The way that most of my students are repressed. That they would express, they would be artists, they would do whatever, storytelling, movies or painting, but then that's not how it works. They have to take over the family business. They are expected that the elder would do business studies, then the second child would do communication arts, so that he or she could deal with the communication department in the family business and so on. And everything is like they don't get much choices about what they can do or not. And in the Thai education system, I would say that artistic expression seems to be discouraged at some point. And when I see my students coming in class, last semester was my best semester over the 5 years. We did something new, which was non-fiction writing, so they have to do autobiographical comics, which was challenging because in Thailand usually there is not much autobiographies in literature, for instance, because you don't talk about yourself because it is seen as rude. But then I tried, and the results were amazing. And all these students who are not having any art formation were really expressing themselves in amazing ways, and I could feel how I really felt they needed that space of creative freedom to say something about themselves that they are never allowed to say because they just have to smile and play a role in a society and in an ISO society where they cannot be really who they want to be. They need to play a part, and that is something that I really love in teaching, is when I feel, maybe I'm wrong because it's not me to say, my students should say that if I'm right or wrong, but when I have the feeling that the students are given that opportunity to express themselves artistically for the first time, that is something that I enjoy so much, to see them create something that really matters to them, that is really showing something about themselves that they are usually not showing. That is so precious, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ajahn Nicholas, for sharing with us your experience and your valuable thoughts นะครับก็ถือว่าเป็นอีกหนึ่งมุมมองที่หลายๆคนไม่นึกนะฮะว่าการอ่านนะฮะสื่อประเภทหนังสือการ์ตูนโดยเฉพาะหนังสือการ์ตูนไทยนะฮะในยุคก่อนเนี่ยจะสามารถมีเนื้อหาสาระอารมณ์ความหมายนัยยะที่แฝงมาได้อย่างลึกซึ้งขนาดนี้นะครับโดยที่นับว่าเป็นการดีนะฮะที่เรามีอย่างน้อยสักหนึ่งคนที่เห็นค่ากับสิ่งที่เรามีอยู่ตรงนี้แล้วนะฮะและเป็นชาวต่างชาติซะด้วยและเชื่อเหลือเกินว่าสิ่งนี้เขาน่าจะสามารถจุดประกายนะครับให้มีการศึกษาค้นคว้าและต่อยอดนะครับในส่วนของการ์ตูนได้ไปอีกยาวๆอีกยาวไกลเลยทีเดียวนะครับวันนี้ต้องขอบคุณอาจารย์นิโคลัสมากๆเลยครับ Thank you so much อาจารย์นิโคลัส
Thank you for having me
ขอบคุณครับขอบคุณครับ
ติดตาม A Day Podcast ได้ทาง adaymagazine.com Joox Apple Podcast Spotify Podbean SoundCloud และ A Day Magazine YouTube Channel